I'm delighted to be a part of the Coronet Inside Out programme. I hope you enjoy these photographs made in rarely seen empty auditoriums and theatres in London during the COVID-19 crisis. As theatre lovers, I'm sure your support for these spaces will mean a huge amount to them.
Welcome to my studio in Oxford. I'm Joanna Vestey. I'm a photographer based here in the city. One of the pieces of work I've made here in Oxford is a body of work called Custodians. And I was interested in the relationship between the buildings and the people who occupy them. I invited each venue to select their custodian. What interested me most is how photography can capture multiple time periods in one image. All of the images were shot using natural light. And with very little direction. So I invited each of the venues to select a custodian, the person that they felt in some way had a long-standing relationship with the space or represented it. And then just invited them to turn up. There was no real direction as to what they'd wear or how they'd stand, but I generally just found a space where the light sat really nicely and their relationship just offset other features in the room. So in this image of Sister Anne Verena, for example, this was made at Bishop Edward King Chapel in Ripon, and she sat in this contemporary space, recently designed by architectural practice Neil McLaughlin. And she's in this quiet, contemplative space, just positioned here, offset by the modern cross and the natural light filling the space. What I loved about this method of working was using the figure for scale. Without a person there, you very much it's very hard to find the size of the building. Yet the fragility of that person, the role that they play within the space, just gives a sense of how we're affected by the buildings and how they in turn affect us. Recently, during the COVID pandemic, I started to rethink this body of work and actually seeing in this way of working an opportunity to say more about the isolated figure, these empty spaces. Under very different circumstances. These were shot during the hustle and bustle of the summer in the city, making arrangements to be in at 7:30 in the morning, 6 o'clock in some cases, ahead of the crowds. It was actually quite hard to get access to many of the spaces, whereas the later body of work, which I'll talk about shortly, was the opposite. The people are excluded, the spaces sit empty and mostly inaccessible for a very different reason. The irony between the two projects is that with the first one, getting access to the spaces when they were empty proved really difficult. Being a busy city and filled with tourists, the spaces in Oxford we needed to shoot in at 6, 7 in the morning and really kind of be careful how we scheduled it. Whereas the later project that I did in the theatres, it was a very different scene, a very tragic scene in a way, that these spaces normally filled with life sit empty under very different circumstances. I work using an old Hasselblad, which traditionally was a film camera, but now you can get a digital back, and there's something extraordinary about this. For me, there's a joy and a hybridity, the way that you can work with a method from the past with something that's incredibly contemporary, which somehow to me speaks to these sort of images as well and the content within them. Jonathan sitting here amongst the old portraits in Trinity College dining hall, and Dr. Paul Coons in the Sheldonian. The detail the digital back's able to capture is staggering, almost more than the human eye can see. project that I made through lockdown was taking the similar idea of the individual within a space, but actually applying it to an area where it felt really needed amplification. And I was really interested in how one art form could support another. So I began to do Custodians for COVID, and it's a series of 20 images all shot in theatres in London, which have all been closed with very uncertain opening dates. Inspired by previous print sales in lockdown, I was interested to see how we could raise money very quickly and directly for these spaces. Collaborating with a friend and fellow photographer Tara Rowse, we set up a bold initiative to raise money for these threatened arts institutions. We produced a collection of 20 photographs, each featuring an affected London theatre, portraying the custodian who was in charge of its care during this time of crisis. Each of the venues selected their own custodian, and it was great to be able to celebrate the person who had been left in care. People who ranged from the handyman, executive producers, duty managers, front of house. Collectively, custodians who had 150 years experience working in these spaces. At the National, I photographed Kieran in the Littleton Theatre. He'd cycled in every day from Brighton throughout lockdown. When we asked Sadler's Wells which custodian they'd recommend, they suggested Marguerite, who'd been their longest serving front of house manager. At the Globe, we photographed Deborah McGee, who'd been in every day of lockdown. Maureen Martin was described to us as the mother of Battersea Arts Centre. She's opened and closed the doors more times than anyone else on the staff. The images from Custodians for COVID are available on my website. Our idea is if we sell out of each image, it's £50,000 will go directly to the theatre featured. All of them are available for £200 in editions of 250.